On the 14th of August 1827, Josiah Crane, a plantation owner in the rice fields around Charleston, South Carolina, was found dead in his library. His skull was so badly broken that doctors who looked at the body said there were bone fragments stuck in the mahogany desk 6 feet away. The coroner's report, which is still kept in the Charleston County Archives, said that the injuries were consistent with being squeezed by hands that were much bigger and stronger than normal human hands. The only person who might have done it was a woman who was 6'8" tall, weighed more than 240 pounds of solid muscle, and had disappeared into the night in August without a trace. Local historians have been arguing for almost 200 years about whether Sarah Drummond really lived, or if she was just a story made up out of fear and guilt. But the medical records, sale documents, and eyewitness accounts point to something much worse, that she was real, and that what happened in that library was the end of a horror that had been building for years. Before we go on with the story of Sarah Drummond and the night that shocked Charleston society into a silence that lasted for generations, I want to ask you something. If you love real historical mysteries that make it hard to tell what's real and what's scary legend, hit the subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me what city or state you're in. I read all of them, and I'm glad that these long-lost American stories are getting out to people all over the country. Let's go back to the beginning of this nightmare. Now, money is what starts the story of Sarah Drummond, not violence. In the spring of 1823, the port of Charleston was having one of its busiest trading seasons in decades. Every week, ships from the Caribbean, West Africa, and Virginia's tobacco-growing areas brought people to be sold at the markets on Charmer Street and Gadsden's Wharf. Charleston was more than just a port city. It was the center of the domestic slave trade in the American South. People made money by buying and selling people as easily as they did cotton bales or rice barrels. The rice plantations near Charleston were especially cruel places to work. Rice farming was different from cotton farming because workers had to stand in water for hours at a time in swamps full of mosquitoes that carry malaria, snakes that bite, and alligators. The number of enslaved workers who died on rice plantations was shocking. Some estimates from the past say that almost 30% of enslaved people who worked in the rice fields died within their first year. The work was so dangerous, tiring, and deadly that plantation owners had to keep buying new workers to take the place of those who had died. This made the economy bad. Slave traders searched the southern states for strong, healthy workers who could handle the harsh conditions of the rice swamps. Sometimes they found something unusual that would sell for a lot of money. Caleb Rutherford, a slave trader, came to Charleston in March 1823 with a cough of 37 people he had bought in Virginia and North Carolina. There was a young woman, maybe 19 or 20 years old, who stood out right away because she was so big. Records from the auction house say that she was about 7'2" tall and had a body type that was very wide and muscular. People who were there said that she had to duck to get through doorways and that her hands were so big that they could wrap all the way around a man's head. The auction papers said that her name was Sarah. It was common for the first sale papers not to have a last name. She was born on a small farm in Piedmont, North Carolina, to a woman who was enslaved and whose name has been lost to history. It looks like Sarah had a condition that modern medicine would call pituitary gigantism. This is a rare disorder caused by too much growth hormone, which is usually caused by a benign tumor on the pituitary gland. But in the 1,820 seconds, people didn't know this about medicine. People who saw Sarah thought she was just a strange person, a curiosity, and maybe even a very valuable one. It was a hot Tuesday morning in late March when the auction took place. There were a lot of planters, merchants, and people who were just curious about the giant woman at the auction house on Chelma Street. When Sarah was brought up to the platform with her wrists and ankles still chained, the crowd started to murmur. She was almost a full head taller than the auctioneer, a fat man named James Vanderhorst. Vanderhorst had run thousands of these sales, but later told friends that he had never seen anything like her before. The bid started at $400, which was already a lot of money. It quickly rose to $800, then $1,000. Planters yelled their offers, each trying to outbid the other. They saw Sarah not just as a worker, but as a show, someone who could draw visitors and be shown off. A man standing near the back of the room made the winning bid. He was Josiah Crane, and he paid Sarah Drummond $1,300. That year, it was one of the most expensive prices ever paid for a single enslaved person at a Charleston auction. Crane was a rice planter who owned Marsh Bend, a mid-sized plantation about 18 miles southwest of Charleston. It was in the low country, which was full of tidal swamps and winding rivers. He was 42 years old, a widower, and other planters knew him as a strict boss who didn't put up with what he called softness when it came to managing enslaved workers. Witnesses said that Sarah didn't make a sound as she was led away from the auction block. Her wrists were tied with Crane's property mark burned into a leather collar around her neck. She didn't cry or fight back. She just stared straight ahead with dark, unreadable eyes. Her huge body moved with a strange, quiet grace. Even though she was chained up, no one at that auction could have known what they had just seen. They had no idea they were watching the start of a story that would end in blood, mystery, and a legend that would haunt the Low Country for generations. But they might have had a feeling something was wrong because according to the records, while Crane was taking Sarah to his wagon for the trip to Marshbend, an old woman in the crowd, a free black woman who sold flowers near the market, was heard to say, "That man just bought his own death." Marshbend Plantation had all the things that made the Low Country famous and all the things that made it a living hell for the people who had to work there. The main house was a two-story Georgian-style building with white columns and a large porch that looked out over the rice fields that went all the way to the Ashley River. The kitchen building, the overseer's cottage, a barn, a rice mill, and a row of 12 slave cabins made of rough-hewn wood with dirt floors and no windows were all behind the main house. Beyond those were the fields. Hundreds of acres of carefully planned rice paddies linked by a complex network of dikes, ditches, and floodgates that controlled the tidal water flow that was necessary for growing rice. Sarah got to Marshbend in late March 1823 and was given cabin number 7, which she would share with 5 other women. Porter Grimble, the overseer, was a thin, nervous man who looked like he was worried about her size. He wrote to his brother in Columbia, and the letter is still in the South Carolina Historical Society archives. In it, he said that Sarah was so big that she had to stoop to get into the cabin, and when she stood up straight, she looked more like an ancient colossus than a Christian woman. But Josiah Crane didn't pay Sarah $1,300 to just work the fields. He had something else in mind. Crane started showing Sarah to visitors within the first week of her arrival. He would invite nearby planters, merchants from Charleston, and even gentlemen who were passing through to Marshbend to see the giant he had bought. They would take Sarah to the main house and make her stand in the parlor or on the front porch to show how big and strong she was. Crane would make her lift heavy things like barrels of rice, iron anvils, and even full-grown pigs. He would stand next to her so that people could see how much taller he was than her. He would tell her to stretch out her hands so that men could put their own hands inside hers and see how different they were. Dr. Edmund Portier, a doctor from Charleston who visited Marshbend in May 1823, wrote a diary entry that gives a chilling look at these shows. Dr. Portier wrote, "Mr. Crane has acquired a female specimen of most extraordinary proportions. She stands at least 6 and 1, 2 feet in height, perhaps more, with hands and feet of such dimension that I could scarcely credit my own measurements. Her strength appears commensurate with her size. I observed her lift a barrel of rice, weighing no less than 300 pounds with apparent ease. Mr. Crane informs me he has received numerous offers to purchase her, but he declines as she has become quite the attraction in our county. I confess the sight of her produced in me an unsettling sensation, as if nature herself had been experimenting with proportions beyond the normal boundaries of the human form." These shows were just the start of Sarah's problems at Marshbend. When Crane's guests weren't looking at her, she was made to work in the rice fields where most people would have given up after a few months. It was hard and dangerous work to grow rice in the South Carolina Low Country. Before dawn, workers would wade into the flooded fields and stand in water up to their thighs for 10 to 12 hours at a time, bent over in the hot sun, planting, weeding, or harvesting rice. The water was salty and full of leeches and water moccasins. There were a lot of mosquitoes in the air. The heat was unbearable, and the humidity coming from the swamps made it worse. Sarah's huge size made her both useful and a target. She could carry things that would take 2 or 3 normal workers to do. The overseer was amazed at how fast and strong she could use the heavy wooden pestles to thresh rice. But being able to see her also made her weak. Crane would often choose Sarah as an example of what happened to people who worked too slowly or disobeyed him. He did this not because she had done anything wrong, but because punishing someone her size sent a message that no one was out of his reach. The punishments were very harsh. Historical records from rice plantations show that people were punished with whipping posts, wooden stocks, and a device called the buck. With the buck, a person would have to sit with their knees pulled up and a stick placed under their knees and over their arms, which would keep them from moving for hours in a painful position. Sarah went through all of these things. At least 3 times during Sarah's first year at Marshbend, Overseer Grimble wrote letters saying that she was publicly punished for being rude or refusing to be shown. But Sarah didn't give in, at least not the way Crane thought she would. Sarah became someone the community both feared and depended on, according to testimony from other enslaved people at Marshbend. This testimony was only collected years later under very different circumstances. She was strong enough to do the hardest jobs, like moving the huge floodgates that controlled the flow of water into the rice fields, hauling timber for repairs, and lifting boats out of the water. But she was also there to keep them safe. People said she would step between a child's whip and an overseer, even though the child was too young to work. People said she carried workers who had passed out from the heat back to their cabins. Stories of her standing still and silent while Crane tried to separate mothers from their children during sales to other plantations. She didn't talk much. When she did speak, her voice was low and steady, and it had an authority that didn't seem to fit with her status as property. Some of the older enslaved people at Marshbend started calling her Tall Sarah, or just the Wall, because once she decided to stand somewhere, nothing could move her unless it was forced, and Josiah Crane was starting to see that force alone might not be enough. Crane and Sarah had their first big fight in the summer of 1824, about 15 months after she moved to Marshbend. A man from Charleston named Augustus Peaton heard about the giant slave woman and went to Marshbend with an offer. He would pay Crane $300 to bring Sarah to Charleston for 2 weeks to show her off at a traveling exhibition he was putting together that would feature strange things from nature and science. The show would have preserved specimens, machines, and Sarah as the main attraction. Crane said yes right away. It was too tempting to turn down the chance to make money while also improving his standing in Charleston society. He told Sarah about the plan and thought she would go along with it as she always had, but this time things were different. A house servant named Ruth, who was there during the conversation, said that Sarah looked Crane in the eye and said very quietly, "I will not go." Crane was shocked. He had owned Sarah for a year and a half, and she had never directly disobeyed an order. He said the command again, this time louder. Sarah said no again, and her voice stayed steady and low. Crane's face turned red. He asked for the boss. He told them to take Sarah to the whipping post right away. What happened next caused a lot of talk among the enslaved people at Marshbend and would be whispered about for years. 4 men, including Overseer Grimble, tried to push Sarah toward the post. She didn't fight them. She just stopped moving. She put her feet down and became dead weight. The 4 men pulled, pushed, and hit her with their fists and a cane. But Sarah wouldn't move. Sarah finally walked to the post after 8 men used ropes and then threatened to hurt other enslaved people if she didn't do what they said. 30 lashes with a braided leather whip were the punishment. Witnesses said that Sarah didn't make a sound during the beating, even though the rough cotton dress she was wearing was soaked with blood. When it was over and she was finally free from the post, she walked back to her cabin on her own. Her back was torn up, but her posture was still straight. She didn't go to Charleston. Crane, embarrassed in front of his boss and workers, finally told Peaton the deal was off, making up an excuse about Sarah getting sick. But things had changed at Marshbend. Yes, the other slaves had seen that Sarah could get hurt, but they had also seen that she could make Josiah Crane back off. That scared Crane more than he wanted to say. An uneasy balance formed over the next year. Crane still showed Sarah to people who came to Marshbend, but he stopped trying to get her off the plantation. Sarah kept working in the fields with the same quiet, unyielding strength. The punishments kept happening, but they happened less often, as if Crane knew that each one made him less powerful instead of more powerful. But something else was growing beneath the surface of that daily routine. It would come to a terrible end on a hot August night in 1827 and change everything. Sarah got pregnant in the spring of 1826. There is no official record of who Sarah's child's father was, but other enslaved people at Marshbend have told the same story. His name was Marcus, and he was about 30 years old. He was a carpenter on the plantation and was good at the complicated woodwork needed to keep the floodgate and rice mill systems running. 2 years before Sarah, Marcus had come to Marshbend. He bought it at an estate sale in Georgetown. People said he was a quiet, thoughtful man who could fix almost anything. He had lost his wife and daughter years ago when they were sold away from him. People say that Marcus and Sarah's relationship was based on respect, not passion. In a world where so much was taken from them and their bodies and work were owned by someone else, they found something like partnership in each other. After work, they would sit together in the evenings and talk quietly outside the cabins. Marcus would talk to Sarah about the places he had been and the things he had made. Sarah would listen. She had moved so many times as a child that she could hardly remember what her mother's face looked like. In early 1826, Sarah found out she was pregnant, and the news spread quickly through the slave quarters. Being pregnant on a plantation was always hard, full of hope and new fear. A child meant family, the chance to do something other than work all the time, and the chance to be weak. It meant that another life could be put in danger, sold, or used as a bargaining chip. And on a plantation owned by someone like Josiah Crane, it was dangerous. From the start, Sarah's pregnancy was hard. Carrying a child was hard for her because of her size, which was what made her valuable to Crane. She kept working in the fields for the first few months of her pregnancy, as all enslaved women were expected to do. However, the other women at Marsh Bend noticed that she moved more slowly and would sometimes stop and press her hand to her lower back, which made her face show a rare flicker of pain. Crane also noticed, but for different reasons. In his mind, a pregnant slave woman was just another piece of property, another person he could own, sell, or use. He started talking openly about the baby, telling visitors that he thought the baby would be very big because the mother was very big, and wondering how much the baby would be worth when it was old enough to sell. The house servants heard these comments and told Sarah about them. They filled her with a cold fear that she had never felt before. She had been beaten, humiliated, tired, and hungry. But the idea of her child being treated like Crane, had treated her like an animal, punished for fun, maybe even sold away, was too much for her to bear. Marcus saw that Sarah had changed. Her face was hard and her eyes were far away. She was even quieter than usual. At night she would sit outside the cabin with her hands on her stomach and stare at the main house. Even people who knew her well were scared by the look on her face. In November 1826, Sarah was told to stop working in the fields and given lighter jobs around the plantation, like shelling rice, mending things, and working in the kitchen garden. Her belly had gotten so big that it was hard for her to move around like she usually did, but even in this weakened state, she was still a strong presence. The people who worked in the kitchen said that when Sarah stood in the doorway of the kitchen building, she completely blocked out the sun. The baby was born in late January 1827 on one of the coldest nights of the winter. Sarah went into labor just after midnight. Two older enslaved women, Hester and Dina, who were midwives for the plantation community, were there to help her. The work was long and very hard. Sarah yelled that night, even though she had never cried out during beatings. The sound traveled over the frozen fields and woke Crane up in the main house. He later said that he lit a lantern and walked to the slave quarters where he stood outside cabin 7 and listened to what was going on inside. The baby boy was born just before dawn. He was almost 11 tomnano, which is big for a newborn, but he looked healthy and normal in every other way. Hester would later say that Sarah cried for the first time anyone at Marsh Bend had ever seen when the baby cried. She held her son close to her chest and looked at his tiny hands and face, whispering things that only she could hear. Not long after the birth, Marcus was allowed into the cabin. He stood next to Sarah and looked down at the child. People who were there said that something passed between them at that moment, some unspoken agreement or understanding. Jacob was the name Sarah gave her son. It, Clear's throat, was a biblical name that many enslaved people had, and it meant struggle and survival. There was something like happiness in cabin 7 for a few short weeks despite everything. Sarah would feed Jacob, hold him for hours, and sing to him in a low voice that sounded like thunder far away. Marcus would carve little wooden animals for the baby and put them in the cradle he had made. However, Josiah Crane was watching and waiting. Jacob was 6 months old by the summer of 1827. He was getting bigger quickly, already bigger than most babies his age, and he had started to smile and reach for things with his chubby hands. Sarah was back at work, but it was easier work than before, mostly around the buildings on the plantation. She always kept Jacob close by, either carrying him on her hip or back while she worked, or keeping him in her sight. Marcus had made a better cabin for them out of scrap wood and his skills. He added a real door with a latch and a small window with shutters. It was still a slave cabin, and it was still barely good enough for them to live in, but it was theirs, and they tried to make it into a family inside those rough walls. But Josiah Crane's money problems were getting worse in Charleston. Crane had made some bad investments in a shipping business that failed, and the rice market had been unstable for a few years. He owed money to a number of people and they were getting more and more demanding. If Crane couldn't get money quickly, he might lose Marsh Bend completely by July 1827. He thought the answer was easy. Sell some of his slaves. He could sell 5 or 6 people and pay off enough debt to keep his job. The question was, which one should I sell? A slave trader named Nathaniel Gadsden came to Marsh Bend on a hot, humid Tuesday afternoon in early August. Gadsden was a well-known figure in the Charleston market. He bought enslaved people from planters who were having money problems and then sold them at auction or to plantation owners in Georgia and Florida. People knew him for making tough deals and not caring where families went after he bought them. Crane and Gadsden walked around the plantation for a few hours, looking at the enslaved workers and talking about their ages, skills, and possible prices. Gadsden stopped and stared when they got to the part of the yard near the kitchen garden where Sarah was working and Jacob was sleeping on her back in a cloth sling. A boy named Peter, who was supposed to be carrying water but was hiding behind a pile of wood close enough to hear, heard the conversation that followed. The only direct account of what was said comes from Peter's testimony, which was given many years later. Gadsden asked, "Lord Almighty, is that the big woman I heard about?" Crane said, "That is Sarah, 68, the strongest worker I have, and the child, her son, who is about 6 months old." Gadsden walked up to Sarah and circled her while she worked, her face blank. He seemed especially interested in Jacob. "How much for the kid?" "How much?" Gadsden asked. Sarah's hand stopped moving and she didn't turn around, but her whole body went stiff. "I hadn't thought about selling him separately," Crane said. "I have a buyer in Savannah, a rich family looking for a house servant they can train from birth. They pay a lot of money for kids, easy work, good conditions. I could give you $400 for that baby right now." There was a long silence. Sarah slowly turned to face them, still holding her hoe. Her face was completely blank. "400 today cash?" Crane asked. "I bring him with me when I leave this afternoon." Peter said that Sarah made a sound low in her throat like an animal, but she didn't speak. Crane looked at her and then back at Gadsden. "I need to think about this." But everyone who heard that conversation knew the truth. Josiah Crane needed $400 more than he needed to keep a 6-month-old baby on his plantation. It was only a matter of time. That night in Cabin 7, Sarah and Marcus whispered urgently to each other until long after dark. No one knows exactly what they said, but the decision they made would have a lasting impact. The next morning, the 13th of August, 1827, Marcus was gone. He had disappeared during the night, taking nothing with him except the clothes on his back. It was not unusual for an enslaved person to run away from a plantation, but it was very dangerous. The roads were patrolled, and slave catchers worked throughout the low country with dogs and weapons. The punishment for captured runaways was brutal, but Marcus didn't run away by himself. He had a detailed map of the plantation, the area around it, and the way to Charleston sewn into the lining of his coat by Sarah. He also had a letter addressed to anyone in Charleston who might be able to help. The letter explained that Josiah Crane was going to sell a baby and begged for help for anything that might stop it. It was a desperate plan that was almost certain to fail, but it was the only one they had. Crane learned about Marcus's disappearance just after dawn. He was furious. He told Overseer Grimald to get a search party together right away, to call the slave patrol, and to send riders to Charleston to keep an eye on the roads. The plantation was in chaos all morning as men on horseback spread out through the swamps and fields around it, looking for any sign of Marcus. They found him just after noon, about 8 miles from Marsh Bend, trying to cross a creek. The slave patrol had dogs, and Marcus had left a trail through the soft mud near the water. They brought him back to Marsh Bend, tied up with ropes, bleeding from dog bites on his arms and legs, but still alive. What happened next was the subject of testimony in several legal proceedings over the next few months, but the details differ depending on who was speaking and when. Crane ordered Marcus to be taken to the whipping post right away. He said he would personally punish him and that it would be so severe that it would serve as a warning to anyone else who might think about running. The entire enslaved community had to gather and watch. Sarah was made to stand at the front with Jacob. The punishment was brutal, even by the standards of that time and place. 50 lashes delivered with a heavy leather whip. Marcus was tied to the post, his shirt torn away. Crane swung the whip himself, putting his full strength into each stroke. Blood appeared on Marcus's back after the 5th lash. After the 10th, his skin was torn open in multiple places. After the 20th, he had stopped screaming and hung limp against the ropes. Sarah watched all of it, her face like carved stone, her arms wrapped around Jacob, who was crying now, frightened by the sounds and the atmosphere of violence. Witnesses reported that Sarah's eyes never left Marcus's face, and that Marcus, in the brief moments when he was conscious, looked only at her. When it was over, Marcus was cut down and dragged to his cabin where he was barely conscious. Crane turned to the crowd, his own face flushed and sweaty with blood on his shirt. He said that anyone who helped a runaway or even knew about a planned escape and didn't report it would get the same punishment. Then he told everyone to go back to work except for Sarah. Crane walked up to her and stood so close that she had to look down at him. He was about the same height as Sarah, but next to her, he looked like a kid. But his voice was hard and cold. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "Mr. Gadsden is back, and he will take your son. You won't fight back. You will quietly give the child to the other person. If you cause any trouble or make a scene, I will beat Marcus again, and this time he will not live. Do you get what I'm saying?" Sarah didn't say anything. She just stared down at Crane with her dark, unreadable eyes. After a long time, Crane turned around and walked back to the main house. That night, the plantation was unnaturally quiet. Even the normal sounds of the swamp seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In cabin 7, Sarah sat on the floor holding Jacob, rocking him slowly while he slept. In another cabin, Marcus lay on his stomach, his shredded back treated with grease and herbs by the other enslaved people, drifting in and out of consciousness. And in the main house, Josiah Crane sat in his library going over his account books, calculating how the $400 from selling Jacob would ease his immediate financial pressures. He drank brandy and occasionally looked out the window toward the slave quarters, his face troubled despite his certainty that he had made the right decision. None of them knew that the next night would end in blood, mystery, and a legend that would never truly be solved. On the 14th of August, 1827, it was hot and humid like a summer day in the Low Country, when the air feels thick enough to choke on. The sun rose blood red over the rice fields, filtered through the haze of moisture rising from the swamps. Later, people would remember that detail as if nature itself had been warning them of what was to come. Sarah got up before dawn like she always did. She fed Jacob, changed him, and dressed him in the cleanest clothes she had, a small cotton gown she had sewn herself. She held him close and whispered to him for a long time, words that no one else could hear. Then she carefully put him in the wooden cradle that Marcus had made and went to work. Sarah worked in the kitchen garden all morning with a kind of mechanical efficiency. The other women who worked near her said that she didn't talk to anyone, acknowledge anyone, or even look at anyone. She just went about her tasks with a blank face and precise movements. Several people tried to talk to her to offer sympathy or support, but she didn't respond. It was as if she had retreated to a place deep inside herself that no one could reach. Around mid-morning, Nathaniel Gadsden arrived at Marsh Bend in a wagon driven by his assistant, a young man whose name is not recorded. Gadsden went directly to the main house and was shown into Crane's library, where the two men finalized their transaction. $400 in cash exchanged for ownership papers hastily written up for an infant named Jacob, aged 6 months, property of Josiah Crane, now sold to Nathaniel Gadsden. At noon, Crane sent word that Sarah should bring the child to the main house. The message was delivered by a house servant named Ruth, who had the unenviable task of walking to the kitchen garden and telling Sarah that it was time to give up her son. Sarah's reaction was unexpected. She simply nodded. She put down her hoe, wiped her hands on her dress, and walked calmly to cabin 7. She emerged a few minutes later carrying Jacob, who was awake and looking around with curious eyes. She walked toward the main house without hurrying, without hesitating, her face still showing no emotion at all. The other enslaved people watched her go, many of them weeping. Some expected her to run, to fight, to do something. But Sarah just walked steadily across the yard, up the steps of the main house, and disappeared inside. The next 15 minutes are based on several accounts, mostly from Ruth, who was in the house, and from Overseer Grimball, who was called inside during the exchange. Sarah walked into the library where Crane and Gadsden were waiting. She stood just inside the door, holding Jacob against her chest. Crane motioned for her to come closer and she took 3 steps forward and stopped. The men waited for her to come closer, but she did not move. After a long, awkward silence, Crane spoke. "Sarah, give the child to Mr. Gadsden." Sarah looked at Gadsden, then at Crane. She said, "Please," in a voice so low that they had to strain to hear it. It was the first time anyone at Marsh Bend had ever heard Sarah beg for anything. Crane's face hardened. "The matter is settled, Sarah. Give him the child now." Sarah's arms tightened around Jacob and her voice got a little louder. "Please, I'll work harder. I'll do anything. Please don't take my child." Gadsden shifted uncomfortably. Crane stood up from behind his desk and spoke sharply. "You forget yourself. You don't beg. You do what you're told. Give me the child right now." Sarah stood still for a long time. Then slowly she looked down at Jacob. She kissed his forehead and whispered something to him. Then with hands that were shaking for the first time anyone had ever seen, she held him out to Gadsden. Gadsden stepped forward and took Jacob from her arms. The baby, sensing the change, began to cry. The sound seemed to break something in the room. Sarah's face crumpled for a second, showing raw anguish before she forced it back into blankness. But her hands, now empty, were still outstretched, as if she couldn't quite understand that they no longer held her son. Crane may have felt a little guilty or just wanted the scene to end, so he said more gently, "The child will be well cared for, Sarah. He goes to a good place. You will work and maybe one day you will be able to have more kids. Go back to work now." Sarah slowly lowered her hands. She looked at Crane with a look that Ruth would later say was beyond hatred, beyond despair, something cold and final. Then she turned and walked out of the library, out of the main house, and back toward the slave quarters. Gadsden left Marshbend shortly after noon, with Jacob wrapped in a blanket in the wagon, crying for his mother. Sarah was seen standing near Cabin 7, watching the wagon roll down the long driveway toward the main road. She stood there without moving for nearly an hour after the wagon had disappeared from sight. It was a strange and tense afternoon at Marshbend. Everyone knew something terrible had happened, but life on the plantation went on as usual. The work had to be done. The rice wouldn't harvest itself, so people went back to the fields doing their jobs while their minds were elsewhere. Sarah went back to work too, but something was different. Several people later said that her movements seemed different, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. She worked steadily through the afternoon, refusing food when it was offered and not talking to anyone. Sarah returned to Cabin 7 as full darkness descended. She did not eat the evening meal. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, staring at the empty cradle Marcus had built, her face illuminated by the dim light of a single candle. Around 9, she stood up, blew out the candle, and left the cabin. Several people saw her walking across the plantation grounds toward the main house. Her figure was unmistakable, even in the darkness, towering and moving with that strange, quiet grace. One man, an elderly field worker named Solomon, later testified that he called out to her, asking where she was going. Sarah did not answer. She simply kept walking. Sarah went back to Cabin 7 as it got dark. She didn't eat dinner and sat on the floor with her back against the wall, looking at the empty cradle Marcus had built. A single candle lit her face. Around 9, she stood up, blew out the candle, and left the cabin. Several people saw her walking across the plantation grounds toward the main house. Her figure was unmistakable, even in the dark, towering and moving with that strange, quiet grace. One man, an elderly field worker named Solomon, later testified that he called out to her, asking where she was going. Sarah did not answer. She simply kept walking. Around 9:30, Sarah Drummond entered the main house through the kitchen door. The clock in Josiah Crane's library, which would later be found stopped at that exact time, said it was 9:30. That night, the main house at Marshbend was quiet. Crane had let most of the house servants go home early, leaving only Ruth and one other servant, an older man named Isaac, who served as butler. Crane himself was in his library, the same room where he had taken Jacob from Sarah's arms just 9 hours earlier. He was working on his account books and sipping from a glass of brandy while reviewing the entries that now included $400 from the sale. Ruth was upstairs in one of the bedrooms making the bed and getting the room ready for the night. Isaac was in the kitchen building, which was separate from the main house as was common in plantation architecture. He was finishing up the cleaning from dinner. Neither of them saw Sarah come in through the kitchen door and walk through the darkened house to the library. We have pieced together what happened in the next few minutes from physical evidence, the accounts of people who got there soon after, and one important witness, Ruth, who heard noises from downstairs and went to check them out. Ruth told the Charleston magistrate 3 days later that she first heard Crane's voice raised in anger, but not quite shouting. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Then she heard another voice, much lower, which she immediately recognized as Sarah's. Ruth quietly walked down the stairs, not sure if she should get involved or not. When she got to the bottom, she heard Crane shout, "How dare you come into this house? Get out right now, or I will whip you until you can't stand." Sarah's answer was too quiet for Ruth to hear clearly, but it made Crane shout again. "The child is sold. The issue is over. You don't have any rights here. You don't own anything, not even yourself." Ruth heard a sound that she thought was furniture scraping, like a chair being pushed back quickly. Then she heard Crane's voice again, but this time it was higher and scared. "Stay back, don't come any closer. I'm giving you a warning." Ruth was scared but felt a strong urge to move to where she could see through the partially open library door. What she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sarah stood in the middle of the library, her head almost touching the ceiling. Crane had backed up against his desk, his face pale, and one hand was reaching behind him as if he was looking for something. The lamp on the desk cast wild shadows, making Sarah's figure seem even bigger, almost like a monster. Sarah said, "I want my son back." Her voice was calm and steady. Crane said, "Impossible. He is sold. The law is on my side. You are my property, and that child was my property, and I had every right to. I want my son back." Crane's hand found what he was looking for, a gun he kept in the desk drawer. He pulled it out and pointed it at Sarah with a shaking hand. "I will shoot you if you take another step. I swear to God that I will shoot you where you are." Sarah looked at the gun and then stepped forward. "Stop." Crane's voice broke. "I will do it. I will." Sarah took another step. She was close enough now that she could have reached out and touched him. Crane pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Ruth screamed, but when the smoke cleared, Sarah was still standing. The ball had struck her in the left shoulder, tearing through muscle and striking bone, but she had not fallen. She had barely moved. Blood was spreading across her dress, black in the lamplight, but her face showed no pain, only that same terrible blank determination. Crane looked at her in shock. He tried to the gun again for a second shot, but his hands were shaking too much. Sarah reached out and took the gun from him like it was a toy. She threw it across the room where it hit the wall and fell to the floor. "Where is my son?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Crane said, backing up against the desk with nowhere to go. "Gadsden took him. I don't know where. I promise I don't know." Sarah stood there for a long time, looking down at Crane. Blood was dripping from her shoulder and hitting the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet that Ruth could barely hear it. "You took everything from me. You took my child, my body, my work, and my dignity. You took it all. What else do you need to take?" "Please," Crane said softly. "Please, I can get him back. I can find him. I can." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She reached out with both hands and took Crane by the head, wrapping her huge hands around his skull like someone would hold a melon. Crane tried to scream, but the sound was cut off almost right away. Ruth turned and ran. She ran out of the house and across the yard, screaming for help. Behind her, she heard a sound from inside the library that sounded like a pumpkin being smashed, followed by the heavy thump of something big falling to the floor. When Overseer Grimald and 2 other men got to the main house, maybe 3 minutes later, the library was quiet. Grimald, who was carrying a rifle, went in carefully, expecting violence. What they found was worse than violence. It was death. Josiah Crane was lying on the floor next to his desk on his back, with his eyes open and staring at nothing. His head was misshapen, crushed with such force that blood and brain matter had sprayed across the desk and nearby books. The physical evidence was clear. He had been killed by compression by hands of extraordinary size and strength, squeezing his skull until it fractured and collapsed inward. Sarah was gone. The window behind the desk, which looked out over the back of the property toward the swamps, was open. A trail of blood led from Crane's body to the window and out into the darkness beyond. The men stood in shocked silence for a moment, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Then Grimald took control. He sent one man to ride to Charleston immediately to alert the authorities. He sent another to gather all the enslaved men to form a search party. He posted guards at the main house to preserve the scene. Grimald knew in his heart that they would not find Sarah Drummond even as he gave these orders. The swamps around Marshbend were huge, dark, and dangerous. Someone who knew them well could get lost in that wilderness and never be found. Plus, Sarah had just killed a white plantation owner in front of a witness, so she had nothing to lose. The search began within the hour, but it was chaotic and disorganized. Men with torches and dogs spread out into the swamps, calling out, crashing through the underbrush. They found the blood trail easily enough, droplets leading away from the house into the rice fields and then toward the treine. But at the edge of the swamp, the trail disappeared. The ground was too wet, too tangled with vegetation, and in the darkness it was impossible to track anything with certainty. They searched all night and found nothing, no body, no clothing, no sign that Sarah had been there at all, except for that blood trail that ended at the swamp's edge like a line drawn in the sand. As dawn broke on August 15th, the searchers returned to Marshbend, exhausted and empty-handed. The investigation into the horror at Marshbend revealed something that would haunt Charleston society for generations, just when we thought it was over. If this story gives you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to show your support, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out what happens next, because the mystery of Sarah Drummond was only beginning. On the afternoon of August 15th, Charleston authorities, led by Magistrate William Huger and accompanied by the sheriff, 2 deputies, and a doctor named Dr. James Pillow, arrived at Marshbend. What they found was a plantation in chaos, with the enslaved community terrified and silent, the overseer overwhelmed, and a crime scene that was hard to explain. Dr. Prelow's examination of Josiah Crane's body was thorough and disturbing. His official report, which is kept in the Charleston County Archives, describes injuries that were consistent with massive compression force applied to the cranium, resulting in multiple fractures, brain hemorrhage, and immediate death. The doctor noted that the marks on Crane's skull corresponded to fingers of unusual length and width, and that the force required to produce such injuries would exceed the capacity of most men, requiring strength of an extraordinary nature. At first, the investigation was mostly about finding Sarah. But as the days went by and there was no sign of her, the police started talking to everyone at Marshbend. The stories they heard painted a disturbing picture of life on the plantation and of Sarah herself. Ruth told her story, but she was clearly scared of what would happen to her. Isaac, who had heard the gunshot and seen Sarah's bloody trail leading from the house, backed up her story. Other enslaved people talked about Sarah's size, strength, the years of abuse she had suffered, and the sale of her child the morning of the murder. The gunshot wound made things more complicated. The police found the gun where Sarah had thrown it, and the bullet lodged in the wall behind where she had been standing. This meant that Crane had shot Sarah before she killed him, which raised uncomfortable legal questions about self-defense. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their owner? The law said no, but the circumstances made even the most hardened magistrates uneasy. Marcus was questioned a lot. He was still recovering from his beating and could barely sit up. But the police thought he might know where Sarah was. Marcus said he had been in his cabin all night, too hurt to move, and didn't know what Sarah had done until he heard the commotion afterward. Several other enslaved people backed up his story. The police had to believe him, but they were still suspicious. As news of the murder spread through Charleston and the surrounding low country, people reacted in different ways. The plantation-owning class was outraged and scared. If an enslaved woman could kill her owner without punishment and then disappear, what did that mean for the stability of the whole system? Emergency meetings were called, patrols were increased, and new restrictions were placed on the movements of enslaved people. But in other communities, especially among free black people and those who were against slavery, the story took on different meanings. To some, Sarah became a symbol of resistance. To others, she was a warning about the violence that slavery always caused. To still others, she was just a mother who had reached her breaking point. The search for Sarah went on for weeks, reaching far beyond Marshbend. Slave catchers were hired and rewards were offered. Reports came in from all over the area of sightings of a woman who looked like Sarah, a woman of extraordinary height seen near the Santee River, a giant woman spotted on a road leading north toward North Carolina, and a tall woman asking for food at a church in the back country. But none of these sightings were ever confirmed. When investigators followed up, they found nothing. It was as if Sarah had been swallowed by the landscape itself, becoming part of the swamps and forests that surrounded Marshbend. Then, in September 1827, something strange happened. A letter came to the Charleston magistrate's office. It had no return address and had been left at a post office in Columbia, which is more than 100 miles from Charleston. The handwriting was bad, but readable, and the spelling was unclear, but understandable. It said, "To those looking for the woman, Sarah, I am still alive. I won't be back. I'm going north to look for my son. Anyone who tries to stop me will end up like Josiah Crane. Don't follow me." The letter wasn't signed, but Magistrate Huger thought it was real. The way it was written, the determination, and the threat all seemed to fit with what he knew about Sarah. But it raised more questions than it answered. Did Sarah really make it all the way to Columbia? Was she still alive even though she had been shot? And most importantly, did she really plan to look for her son? The authorities didn't make the letter public because they were afraid it would inspire other enslaved people or cause panic among plantation owners. Instead, they shared it privately with slave traders and catchers across the region, asking them to keep an eye out for a woman who looked like Sarah, especially one who was asking questions about a child named Jacob who had been sold in August. Nathaniel Gadsden, the trader who bought Jacob, was questioned a lot. He said that 2 days after leaving Marsh Bend, he sold the child to a family named Hafford in Savannah, Georgia for $500. The Hfords were contacted and confirmed that they had bought an infant boy in mid-August and that he was healthy and in their care. They were understandably worried about what Sarah had done, so they hired armed guards to watch their property for months after that. As 1,127 turned into 1,828 and then 1,829. The search for Sarah slowly came to an end. She had not been found and no one had reported seeing her anywhere. The authorities decided that she had probably died from her gunshot wound in the wilderness and her body was never found. The case was officially closed, but a standing warrant for her arrest stayed on the books for decades. But the story didn't end there. The rumors continued for years and decades. In the years after Sarah went missing, stories started to spread across the South about meeting a woman who was very large. These stories were whispered in slave quarters shared in free black communities and even reported by white travelers who said they had seen something strange. In 1831, a group of escaped slaves who had made it to Pennsylvania via the Underground Railroad said that a woman they described as a giant, taller than any person they had ever seen, had helped them along their journey. She moved through the forest like a spirit and knew every hidden path. When they asked her name, she only said, "I am looking for my son." In 1835, a plantation overseer in northern Georgia said he saw a woman who looked like Sarah at the edge of his property, asking about recent slave sales. When he tried to keep her there, she picked him up with one hand and threw him aside like a child. By the time he got help, she was gone. In 1842, a Quaker woman running a safe house on the Underground Railroad in Ohio wrote in her diary about a visitor who stayed for one night. She was very tall and had a strong presence. She arrived at our door seeking shelter and information about the location of a child sold from Charleston years ago. She wouldn't tell him her name. She had scars from the past that looked like they were from violence. She cried when we told her we didn't know anything about her son. She was gone in the morning. These stories, along with dozens of others, became part of the legend of Sarah Drummond. But were they real events or myths based on hope and fear? The historical record doesn't give us any clear answers. What we do know is that in the years after 1827, several plantations in South Carolina and Georgia reported thefts of food, clothing, and medicine, and witnesses said the thief was a woman of unusual height. Some plantation owners became convinced that Sarah was living in the swamps and forests, surviving on stolen goods, and maybe helping other runaways escape to freedom. A plantation owner named Samuel Gillard kept a diary that gives us a lot of information. His property was next to the Francis Moran National Forest in South Carolina. In an entry from 1838, Gillard wrote, "My overseer swears he saw the giant that killed Josiah Crane all those years ago. He says she was standing so still at the edge of the trees at dusk that she looked like she was part of the forest. She just turned and walked into the woods when he got closer. He followed her for a mile, but the trail ended in a creek. I don't know if I should believe him or think that he has an overactive imagination because he drank too much whiskey, but he was really shaken up and he is not a man who likes to make things up." The story of Sarah meant different things to different groups of people. For enslaved people, she became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most oppressed person could fight back against their oppressor. Songs were sung about her in the slave quarters, though always carefully, always in code. In some versions of these songs, Sarah became a kind of avenging spirit, protecting runaways and punishing cruel masters. Among white Southerners, particularly plantation owners, Sarah became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing enslaved people too far, and also a monster story used to justify even harsher controls and punishments. Some claimed she had become a cannibal living in the swamps. Others said she had gone mad and would attack any white person she encountered. These stories, however absurd, revealed deep anxieties about the system of slavery itself and what might happen if that system were truly challenged. In the North, free black communities and abolitionists told another version of Sarah's story. In their version, she became a hero who fought for freedom and then escaped to the North, maybe even Canada. Some said she had been reunited with her son, while others said she had become an active conductor on the Underground Railroad, using her knowledge of the southern wilderness to guide hundreds of people to freedom. As is often the case with legends, the truth was probably much less interesting and more tragic than any of these stories. But one thing was clear: Sarah Drummond was never caught, never confirmed dead, and never seen again with any certainty by anyone who could prove it. I have looked at every document, testimony, and piece of evidence that is still around from that night in August 1827 and the years that followed. I can't say for sure what happened to Sarah Drummond after she climbed through that library window and disappeared into the swamps, but I can tell you what the evidence suggests. The gunshot wound Sarah got from Josiah Crane was very bad. The coroner's report said there was blood at the scene that was consistent with a serious injury. Dr. Prelo, who looked at the scene the next day, said that without medical help, such a wound would probably get infected and kill her in a few days or weeks. Sarah couldn't get medical help because she was a fugitive in a dangerous area where men with dogs and guns were looking for her. The most likely scenario, the one that most historians who have studied this case accept, is that Sarah died within a few days of escaping Marshbend. She probably made it some distance into the swamps, perhaps following waterways where dogs could not track her scent, but eventually succumbed to her wound. Her body, if she died in the deep swamps, would have been quickly consumed by the ecosystem. Alligators, wild pigs, and the simple process of decomposition in that hot, wet environment. Within weeks, there would have been nothing left to find. This explanation accounts for why no confirmed sightings of Sarah ever occurred, why the authorities never found any solid evidence of her continued existence, and why the blood trail from Marshbend ended so abruptly. It is the rational, evidence-based conclusion. And yet, there are details that don't quite fit this neat explanation. The letter that was sent to Columbia was real. Someone wrote it, and they knew things about Sarah that weren't public knowledge. If Sarah died in the swamps near Marshbend, who wrote that letter? The reports from the Underground Railroad operatives are also hard to ignore completely. These were serious people who were committed to their cause and not likely to spread false rumors. When they said they saw a woman who looked like Sarah, they did so in private letters and diaries, not in public statements meant to inspire or mislead. And there is one more piece of evidence that I have saved for last because it is perhaps the most intriguing and the most difficult to verify. In 1889, 62 years after the death of Josiah Crane, a physician in Philadelphia named Dr. Robert Hayes was treating an elderly black woman in her sickbed. The woman was dying, and in her final days, she told Dr. Hayes a story. She claimed that her mother had been an escaped slave from South Carolina, a woman of extraordinary size who had killed her owner in the 1,120 seconds. The woman said her mother had survived for years in the wilderness before eventually making it north with the help of free black communities and Quaker abolitionists. She said her mother had searched for her first child, a son named Jacob, for more than a decade, but never found him. Eventually, she had settled in Pennsylvania, taken a new name, and lived quietly until her death in 1867. Dr. Hayes wrote to a colleague about their conversation, saying that he found the woman's story amazing, but couldn't prove it. The woman died 2 days after their conversation, and Dr. Hayes never found out her name or tried to look into her claims. A historian looking into Civil War-era medical practices in Philadelphia found the letter in 2003. Could this woman have been Sarah Drummond's daughter? Could Sarah have really survived, really escaped, really lived to old age in Pennsylvania? We will never know for certain. The evidence is too thin, too circumstantial, separated by too many years. What we do know, what is incontrovertibly documented and real, is what happened on the night of August 14th, 4827 in that library at Marshbend. We know that a woman who had been treated as property, exhibited as a curiosity, worked to exhaustion, beaten and humiliated, finally reached a point where she had nothing left to lose. We know that when her child was taken from her, when the last thing she had to care about was torn from her arms and sold for $400, something inside her broke. Or perhaps it did not break. Perhaps it crystallized into something hard and final and unstoppable. We know that Josiah Crane died that night, his skull crushed by Sarah's bare hands. We know that Sarah disappeared and was never found. And we know that for nearly 2 centuries, people have wondered and debated and told stories about what really happened to the giant slave woman of Charleston. The truth is probably simpler and sadder than the legends. But the legends persist because they speak to something fundamental about the human spirit and what happens when that spirit is pushed beyond endurance. Sarah Drummond, whether she died in those swamps or lived to old age in Pennsylvania, became more than just one woman. She became a symbol of resistance, of maternal love, of the breaking point where oppression transforms into rage and rage into action. And perhaps that is why her story has never been forgotten, even when the facts themselves have become uncertain, because we want to believe that Sarah survived. We want to believe that she found her son, or at least that she lived free for some years before she died. We want to believe that someone who suffered so much and fought back so fiercely was rewarded with something more than a lonely death in a swamp. But history doesn't care what we want to believe. It only cares about what happened and what can be proven. The documented truth is this: Sarah Drummond killed Josiah Crane on the 14th of August, 1827, and then disappeared from history as if she had never existed at all. But she did exist. The sale records, the medical exams, the testimonies, and most importantly, Josiah Crane's crushed skull, all prove it. Sarah Drummond was real. What she did was real. And somewhere in the swamps of South Carolina, the forests of Georgia, or maybe in a quiet grave in Pennsylvania, her bones are still resting. We can be more sure about what happened to Jacob, Sarah's son. Records show that the Hafford family of Savannah raised him as a house servant. He lived until 1891 when he died at the age of 64 and was buried in a small cemetery outside Savannah. After emancipation, Jacob worked as a carpenter and started his own family. In the 1,930 seconds when the Federal Writers Project interviewed his descendants, they said that Jacob knew the story of his mother and what she had done. He told his children that he always carried with him a small wooden toy carved in the shape of a horse that his father Marcus had made for him before he was sold away from Marshbend. He named his first daughter Sarah. This mystery shows us that even in the darkest times in American history, there were people who refused to be dehumanized, fought back against impossible odds, and became legends just because they dared to resist. What do you think of this story? Do you think Sarah made it north and survived? Or did she die in the swamps near Charleston? Do you think the doctor's account from 1089 was real, or just another legend built on hope? Leave your comment below. If you like this story and want more horror stories based on real American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and enduring legend. See you in the next. 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 See you in the next.